I'm Kirsten Helton from the Queensland Police, and I'd like to introduce my research partner, Sarah Bennett from the University of Queensland. I'd also like to mention our absent partners, Katrina Carr and John Gilmore. Hopefully you're watching online. So together, we're going to tell you about the research we have done that shows the transformation of responses to investigating sexual assault, directly resulting from a training program we conducted. This doesn't come about just in silos, so we would like to acknowledge the many people that helped us put this together, the training and the research, particularly the funding for the research. In particular, the experts and survivors of lived experiences. Without them, the training wouldn't be possible. Sexual assault is the most intimately violent offence that can occur to a person. Alarmingly, in 2021, across Australia, 30,000 reports of sexual assault occurred. So breaking this down to the statistics of prevalence, that's 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men. We know a few things about these statistics, and that is they're grossly underreported. In fact, about 85% are not reported. So whilst this in itself is an issue, and we need to explore why that occurs, the problem exists for us in policing when they are reported, and then those reports, the attrition rates are high. So we've worked out this can be linked to some things such as victim shame, fear, and most concerningly, mistrust of the police. These negative experiences with police can result in secondary trauma for the victim. So it's a notion that became the focus for us in our training and research, as we saw that every reported case every reported case was an opportunity in the very best for policing. So breaking that down for Queensland, which more specifically for us, as a result of 3 major inquiries, including a Royal Commission, that was within a space of about 10 years, the QPS was heavily criticised with how we deal with our victims of these heinous crimes. So we identified some key themes. There's 5 there which become circled, and from these recommendations that we thought we actually could influence with our training. So the 5 is the procedural fairness, poor training opportunities, police officers not being victim focused, we lacked understanding of trauma and complex trauma, and more concerningly, our culture and attitudes towards the victims. So we wanted to do things better, and we wanted to get things just right, and we wanted to prove that we could do things better and that we were getting things just right. And by doing this, we thought that we were providing better outcomes for the victims, and it was always about the victims that we were concerned about. So subsequently, in 2016, the ICQ course was developed. And ICQ stands for Investigating Sexual Assault, Corroborating and Understanding Relationship Evidence. It's a 2-week training program that we offer targeting specialist investigators. And it's based on these 6 core components that you see there. The first one being research. So we founded it on proven concepts by numerous experts and contemporary theories of trauma and bias and those sorts of things. With the police role, we look at police officers, the role that police officers play in the process, particularly focusing on their biases, attitudes, and misbeliefs, beliefs and myths of trying to shift that culture that was a problem. We looked at the victims themselves and tried to bring an understanding of complex trauma with a victim-centric approach to our investigations, whilst understanding what we call the whole story concept. We then also looked at the offending behaviours, and we focused on understanding the offenders and the typologies and the victimology of offenders. We then looked at the justice aspect of investigating these types of offences. So we wanted to understand how we could best gather the evidence from a victim, utilising within the boundaries of the legislative provisions, ensuring that the principles of procedural justice were complied by. And last but not least, we looked at police wellbeing. We wanted to acknowledge that investigators of these types of crimes themselves can suffer trauma, certainly not taking away from the victim's trauma, but officers doing this all the time can suffer vicarious trauma and post-traumatic stress. So we wanted to make sure they were looking after themselves and they were the best version of themselves in order to ensure that they were giving the best service to the victims. So that's the happy foursome. Katrina and John are depicted there as well, so it's kudos to them that when we talk about we, it's all of us. So simultaneously, along with the development of the training, the partnership commenced with UQ, and it's never stopped. You know, we're stuck, aren't we? Honestly, it was a great leap of faith to let outsiders in, and as we know as police, we're really wary of outsiders and strangers, and we don't like to be told, and we know everything, you know, just ask us. But the partnership is built on trust, and we needed to share data in relating to investigator performance, and we opened ourselves up to that external scrutiny. Like from day one when we met Sarah, we knew that she was the one for us. You know, we wanted to ensure that we had the timing of the evaluation just right as well, and we didn't want to do it after the fact, like has been mentioned in the last few days, that, you know, we've done this and now can you evaluate it? So, you know, we did it simultaneously.
So we sought to evidence whether the 2-week training course that the QPS had developed provided officers with the tools to better engage survivors and offenders in the investigative process, and also for the officers to maintain their own well-being. So our evaluation was twofold. Firstly, we wanted to know that the iSecure course led to greater knowledge and skills to facilitate improved responses to sexual offences, and we assessed that through a pre-post course survey. But that was really just a litmus test, I suppose, that the course had indeed delivered all the components of that training wheel that Kirsten just mentioned. But importantly, our priority was to test whether the training actually impacted on behaviours of investigators in a meaningful and applied way and led to improved outcomes. And that will really be the focus of our presentation today. However, we are going to present a little bit of the pre-post survey because hopefully that'll give you insight of sort of what was happening in the box when we look at the official records. The first part of the trial started off as a randomized controlled trial. The course was advertised to Queensland Police Service officers across the state who investigated sexual offences, and essentially 115 officers put in an expression of interest. Now, what was really great about this is essentially we randomly dipped from this pool of officers. Kirsten and Katrina loved that because it meant they didn't have to make any decisions about who got on which course, because the course could only accommodate about 20 officers at a time. So really small, really intense course. So that was actually really good. For these 3 courses, we did that pre-post course survey, which captured that knowledge and skills and perceptions, which we'll go through in a minute. But then we needed time to actually assess the impact of the course on behaviour. And essentially what happened there is we needed a bit of time, and then it actually became really difficult to access the data. There were Queensland bushfires, then there was COVID, and then when we actually went to get the data, we realised that the course had been continuing, of course, and there was an opportunity to increase our sample. And we did that by drawing from the entire population of officers, investigators, eligible investigators in the pool, and creating a match comparison group that was consistent for length of service, gender, investigative load, and a whole range of other factors, so that we had an equivalent control group. Our analysis here is looking at sexual offences, and in Queensland that falls under 2 broad subcategories of rape and attempted rape, and then other sexual offences, which is actually quite diverse. And our analysis ultimately is a 4-year period of data up until the end of 2020, and we're looking at unique occurrence numbers. I'm just going to do this survey first because it hopefully sets the scene. So when we did the survey, what we found is that there were significant differences in investigator knowledge of the impact of trauma on survivors' memory and ability to construct a narrative. They also found that investigators had a greater awareness of their own selves as potential barriers to case progression, awareness of bias, and also the role of well-being and support, not just for survivors, but for officers themselves. And I think that this word cloud presents a very powerful shift of perceptions that occurred in the course. Here you have a question that was asked: what are the barriers to survivors progressing their sexual assault case to prosecution? Larger words in these clouds indicate greater frequency of response. So this was a qualitative question. The officers wrote a sentence or so about this, and so we grabbed the words from that. So here you can see that investigators post-course have a very different perception of why cases do not progress to prosecution. And I guess if I think about what is the impact of that, what do you see in those clouds as someone who is delivering the course?
Well, I guess when we saw that the pre-course, that officers were probably looking towards that the court was a barrier, or the victims themselves were unreliable. So this, to us, didn't depict the victim-focused, trauma-informed practice that we were looking for. So quite quickly, within the 2 weeks of the training, officers' thoughts were transformed into thinking that, realising that trauma, being believed, their memory, were all affected by what had occurred to them. So, it was quite a huge transformation. And, when you first showed the slide to us, it was quite outstanding. Even to the point, during the course, officers fill in like a reflective journal around how they're tracking with investigations, and there's been incidents of officers going, oh my God, I can't wait to get back to the station, I need to reopen some investigations, realising that they were probably letting these barriers that probably didn't need to exist impede their investigation. So that was a really pleasing outcome for us.
So I think you can imagine that the way that you would approach your investigation would be very different before the course than after, the way that you're going to engage with survivors in particular. So that is, just keep this in mind, because I think this is a bit of the black box then of what our official results communicate. So in terms of our investigators, what we essentially did is tracked all the cases that they had been working in the review period. And the first thing to note is that the Queensland Police Service investigators were really busy. Over 72,000 cases, over 6,000 of which were sex offences, of which over 2,500 were rapes and attempted rapes. So, essentially, busy caseloads that the investigators were working on. And this is our first result. In this graph, what we're comparing are outcomes for solved sex offences. The purple bar are the investigators who've not taken the course, and the iSecure results are in green. Gold stars in this presentation indicate statistical significance, so we love the gold stars. Gold stars are good. And you can see here is in the 4-year period of analysis, the investigators solved sex offence cases at a significantly higher rate, so almost 48%, when compared to the control group at 36%. So this difference of 12% higher rates of solve was found after controlling for length of service, just in case anyone asks this question of, well, what was controlled? So length of service, unit, gender, and caseload. So the majority of these solved cases are arrests, so a tremendous outcome for the QPS. And I guess when you see those results, what do you reflect on?
I guess, we can't really measure the added impact that these arrests have on preventing or deterring other offences. We haven't measured that, so that's one of the things.
So this essentially is what we know, but we don't know the impact that this could have indeed on other offences not occurring. With a statistically significant increase in solves for the iSecure group, you would hope for a corresponding reduction of unsolved. So that's what we found here in relation to the comparison group. And on this particular side, we're looking at withdrawn and unfounded cases. So unfounded cases in Queensland Police are cases where the police decide they're not progressible, so they've essentially need to close that case. Whilst not significant, the number of withdrawn and unfound cases are going in the right direction, so they're lower for iSecure group. We're looking at all sex offences here, but we'll come back to this one in a minute because there's some really exciting findings coming up. So now we're just looking, one of the things we wanted to do was just separate out in terms of those two offence categories, just to see whether or not, is it just, are we seeing it in the most severe of offence? Are we seeing the gains there? And we absolutely did. So for this analysis, we can see that a statistically significant difference with 13% greater solves for rape and attempted rape, and about 21% percent more solves for other sex offences. And then we are looking at withdrawn. So this is a serious issue, of course, that Kirsten mentioned at the beginning, that a real goal of the course was to reduce that rate of attrition, that once you have that reported case, actually ensuring that there is an engagement that is effective and keeps survivors engaged right until the whole process. So what we found here is indeed a reduction in withdrawals, and I think probably one of the best results of the course, because what we have here is about a 31% difference in withdrawals. So that I think is very noteworthy, and congratulations on a course that has achieved that outcome. We also wanted to, a consistent message in the iSecure training was the role of support services for survivors. The analysis looked at referrals offered by iSecure investigators post-course. And we found this really interesting as well, because it was actually the detectives with 11 plus years of service, and then, especially 21 plus years of service, who had the biggest increase or change in terms of providing support for survivors. And I guess, what does that mean in terms of practical policing?
So why we see this as such a great result is that generally the officers with more service would investigate the more serious crimes. And so that means that those victims are getting the referral services that they need for ongoing support. And
I guess with any training, and you might be wondering this as well, what was the decay effect? How often are we going to need to top up this training? Training, that's a 2-week investment of training. So that's a huge amount of time for investigators to be outside of their operational role and in the classroom. So how frequently are we going to need to keep repeating this course? We fully expected to see a decay effect for this course, that we were going to need to do top up and perhaps a shorter version within maybe a year or 2 years. And what we found was just the opposite. What appears to have occurred is that there's an incremental impact of the course in terms of the officers applying those new skills, knowledge, and it actually transforming their practice, and indeed, continuing to have increase in achievements. And I think this is particularly significant that that's occurring even more for those more serious offense types as well. So a huge benefit there.
If you remember when I said in the beginning that we wanted to acknowledge investigators and their well-being in investigating these types of crimes. So we wanted to acknowledge as an organisation that sexual assault can be notoriously difficult to investigate. Officers suffer vicarious trauma and burnout, which potentially then they leave the organisation, which is a problem for us. So you may think that evidence that officers taking more leave is counterintuitive to a positive outcome. However, one of the key components of iSecure is that wellbeing component, and we suggest that if officers need to, they need to take leave, and they've clearly taken us at our word. And so over an average, 4 more rec leave days a year and 2 more sick leave days a year are taken by officers that have completed the iSecure. So we do see that as a positive in a way, that it's evidence that they're actually trying to look after themselves. We continued the research with some post-course interviews down the track, and found the responses to continue to be overwhelmingly positive. So officers then had an opportunity to reflect on the learnings and then offer those learnings into their investigations. So here's a couple of snapshots of the interviews and the main themes that were coming through in the interviews, and these were indicative of most of the interviews. So the first one officer was saying that it's a real game changer for them and in how they investigate, and recognise that as officers we judge victims and how they present, not always the way that we think they should. The second comment there relates to improved engagement with victims through the whole story approach that we teach, and led them to locating some further evidence and then providing a support network for that victim, which is a fantastic outcome for that victim.
Just as a sort of a wrap-up for the session, because we're really keen to make this a bit of a discussion or certainly hear your questions. in terms of summary, every reported offence is an opportunity to demonstrate the very best in policing. If someone has actually had the courage, bravery to come and present that case, that's really the point at which we need to ignite and respond in a really effective way. So what we found is that training is a critical contributor to an effective policing response to sex offences. It's worth emphasising again that the training program that Kirsten, Katrina, and the rest of their colleagues developed was based on really best practice research. So, you know, it was a real focus on trauma-informed care, that whole story approach, offender typologies, and whole story interviewing for offenders as well as survivors. The evaluation establishes that evidence-based training investigation actually improved knowledge and skills of trauma, a different approach, interviewing and support, but importantly, it significantly impacted on investigative practice with increased solved cases, reduced victim withdrawals, and increased referrals. The project also establishes, I suppose, a doability for measuring the impact of training. Certainly we feel if we can do this, it's certainly, you know, this is doable. It is doable for us to, and we should be evaluating training. It's a huge investment, so we should absolutely be knowing whether the training that officers are taking part in is actually doing what it's meant to do. So, you know, there's a methodology here. So we've moved from a static pre-post course evaluation. I've taken part of training as well, often get an evaluation, sort of evaluating whether or not it was a good course and I learned something. But we've actually moved that into a dynamic application of training practice, and that's where we need to move to next. So we have some questions. We've also got some more research. Our study explored training impact where we tracked individual investigators, but we know that people work in teams. So one of the things we don't look at when we look at training is actually the dynamic of bringing back those knowledge and skills into a team. What is the, and we also know that teams and demands are different from one team to another. So are we putting the just right accumulation of training resources where they need to go, you know, to meet the area demand? Are some areas over-resourced from a training perspective, while other areas have literally a drop in a dry bucket? And a drop in a dry bucket really is a fizzle. It really is a fizzle where you have someone who has training, but they go into an environment where there is just not that culture and there's not that team in which you're exchanging ideas and working collectively for a common purpose and with a common strategy. So that's as important, I think. What are the opportunity costs of not allocating resources in a way that maximizes both individual and unit level gain? So we're looking for that critical mass of training that achieves the very best outcomes. So we would, this is what we're working on next. So we're moving into sort of a team-based network analysis to explore how the teams exchange skills. But we'd love to come and present back. Sorry, I was trying to sneak in for next year's conference. So we'd love to come back next year, but we'd also love to discuss these with you guys now.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I know that you were focusing really on the evaluation of the training. I guess I had a slightly different question, if you don't mind. So in your pre and post surveys, you obviously mentioned tracking, and I noticed the result around length of service in terms of the increase in referrals. But I wondered whether in terms of knowledge, skills and attitudes, actually pre and post, you noticed any difference around the length of time of officers specialising in these investigations? Because I noticed you mentioned that earlier on, because I think there's obviously an assumption that your skills would increase to the length of time that you're obviously specialising in that field. Knowledge, I think, is an interesting one. Actually, does more recent training, changes in training, actually, would you have more as time goes on? Or would you maybe, and you, a colleague, have more knowledge or more current knowledge? And behaviours is really the one that interests me, because that thing around empathy fatigue, actually, so the longer you specialise in this field, was there a difference pre or post? I'm not sure if you had time to explore it.
So, sorry, just so to understand around the years or a degree of specialization in terms of, have we looked analysis just looking at the more senior officers and them versus those in that sort of under 10 years of service? We haven't yet, and that's a great one to look at. So I am very happy to give you those results. We have looked at specialization, particularly those years of experience on other factors, but not in relation to these results here.
Looking at like stars and significance, it's a very big difference for the victims that you make. But then look, we still kind of have about 50% unsolved cases. So basically, if the victim comes to your agency, it's kind of flipping a coin whether it's solved or not. Had you any chance to analyze all the unsolved cases, what might be reasons that still 50% are not solved? So we see, if you teach the officers, you have a high impact with an increase of solved cases, but what are the reasons and what can be done to actually even higher this more? Looking away from education, maybe some kind of systematic issues with the case or the information that the officers have in the ICQ program, and what could be done potentially, if you've seen any results.
We haven't done that analysis either, but I think that would be absolutely fantastic to do. I think that's a really important area. I mean, the one thing I will say is that this research has really transforming the way the QPS is thinking about literally training from this is a 2-week investment, but trying to, and in fact that's something that Kirsten and colleagues are working on at the moment as well, is literally training from the front desk person, the first protocol for a survivor coming in, making a report, making sure that all those same core ingredients, a trauma-informed care, whole story approach, is actually happening at the front desk. Because I think it's a combination of not just, I think it starts from that moment all the way through. And I think I'd be really, really curious. I'll definitely write that down and be excited if you want to collaborate on that, because I think that's a really important area to work on.
So the first question was, we had invested people, is your question, and has that affected the figures, basically?
So those that are applying for the training obviously are interested in this area of field. So you've got people already wanting to be in this particular part of policing. How did you account for that selection bias?
Okay. Well, that was a randomized.
Yeah, so everyone was wanting to take part in, so they put in their EOI. So that's the first part. But now what's happening?
So, and I guess if you look at the statistics, they continued on a high trajectory around that too. So they were volunteers, you're right. And now we're moved into this as a bit of a poison chalice because it's been so successful. Well, it's not a poison chalice, it's wonderful actually, sorry. It's
got more work.
It's got more work is the thing, that everyone now needs to do the training. So they're being voluntold now instead of volunteered. And so it will be very interesting to see the results from that. And you have those people, those officers that the voluntold, there may be a small percentage that don't believe that they need to change. So
that we definitely will be looking at over time. In relation to the second one, which is around female investigators or gender difference, perhaps you're absolutely, it's a very good point. We didn't present those figures, but the female investigators were the ones who benefited the most from the course. And we've got some qualitative data, which I think just demonstrates that potential bias relating to survivors, and the opportunity really to get that awareness of trauma, and that trauma represents very differently from survivor to survivor.